I'm Dr. Patrick Lewis, the President and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us for the second annual installment of the James J. Holmberg Lecture Series. We are incredibly grateful to our sponsors for tonight's event, the Society of Colonial Wars in the Commonwealth of Kentucky and the General Society of Colonial Wars for their support of this series. The Holmberg Lecture Series began last year with the support of the Colonial Warriors and a generous endowment raised from our membership to honor the retirement of Jim Holmberg, a giant in the fields of early American archives and history who spent more than 40 years as the face of the Filson for academic and public audiences. Our format tonight is going to have some opening remarks, then a conversation with a few questions from me, and then we'll turn over the general Q&A to you all. We will pass a microphone around the audience so that everybody can hear those questions. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand, wait for the mic to find you. If you're joining us online, you can drop your questions in the Zoom chat, and a Filson representative will share them as time permits. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. David Narrett is the author of Adventurism and Empire, The Struggle for Mastery in the Louisiana-Florida Borderlands, and Inheritance and Family Life in Colonial New York City. He is professor of history at the University of Texas at Arlington, where he has taught since 1984. He received his BA at Columbia in 1973 and his PhD at Cornell in 1981. Dr. Narrett's research interests are in American borderlands and frontier history with a focus on the intersection of North American, Indian, colonial, and imperial history. Let's welcome him to the Filson.
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Professor Lewis, and I'm very grateful to be here with you tonight and the hospitality offered by the staff of the Filson, Scott Scarborough, Ben Moore, and others. And to be here in Kentucky with you is a special thrill. In fact, some 8 years ago, when I was a little younger, I did a week's research here that was integrated into this book, and I think made it a stronger one. And I'll allude to a couple of cases as I talk with you this evening. And I became interested in the Cherokees really by exploring the Southern Appalachian and not knowing exactly where my interests would take me. I had written about borderlands, imperial conflicts, and native peoples before colonials, too, of course. And then as I learned more about the Cherokees, I realized there were gaps in the story. That the Trail of Tears, of course, the agony of forced removal and expulsion is well known, but still more can be learned from it, right? And that was in 1838-39. The story that I seek to tell in the Cherokees, my book, The Cherokees in War and at Peace, 1670 to 1840, covers a very broad period where the Cherokees are interacting not only with colonials and empires, but with other native peoples over a vast indigenous geography and landscape. From the Creeks in the south, the Muskogees to the south, to which they are rivals, to the Iroquois in the north, to tribes and nations of the Great Lakes. The Cherokees have an enormous outreach, and one finds this true of many, many native peoples. And as I studied, again, I came to really be amazed at what I found, not only about leading headmen, but more obscure individuals, women as well as men, because Cherokee women had a vital and important role in negotiation and diplomacy. among themselves and not only with others, because women were a bulwark of society. And those of us who live long enough, we know that anyway. But the point is that to the Cherokees, women's role was fundamental because they were the life givers. And those among the Cherokees, as among any number of the southern peoples, native peoples, trace their descent through the mother's line. All blood, the life source, was considered to come from the mother's line. And two colors stand out in a way. I didn't call the book The White and the Red, but there'd be some reason for it, because white was understood to be the color of peace, red, the color of war. But these forces, the white and the red, peace and war, weren't just complete opposites. They coexisted in a way because the Cherokees were not a nation state as we think of a nation state, with a central government and a hierarchy of command, whether that government is elected or not. Most governments in the world are not really truly elected by the people today. So the point is, though, for the Cherokees, as for many peoples who live in non-state societies, consensus, community, kinship, those are the forces that tie people together. And they found agreement with each other about war and negotiation through consultation in town council, and then consultations in river valleys, and then extending it further with Cherokees across several regions. But there was a great deal of autonomy in Cherokee life that is of individuals, men and women too, one finds remarkably, acting in their own way, in a way they believe would further the community's interest, which always came first. And the story of how the Cherokees became a nation is embedded in the book. It's not the only theme, but it is a development that occurred. And I argue, my contention is that they became a nation as much through diplomacy and negotiation as through militant resistance to colonialism. Yes, there was that, and we see that militant resistance beginning in the 1750s and then escalating during the American Revolutionary War, when in 1776, the Cherokees come to be at war with the southern states. And the southern states, 4 of them, the Carolinas, Virginia, and to a much lesser extent, Georgia, launch militia invasions with a total of 6,000 men into the Cherokee country, which is vast in territory, which is large as, let's say, an area of the state of Ohio. And the American militia proceed and they burn to the ground 50 Cherokee towns, virtually all. And of course, there are those who die in battle. And of course, the Cherokees are fighting too in their mostly guerrilla style and attacking white settlers. And the Cherokees, the militants, took the British side during the American Revolutionary War, not necessarily because they simply loved the British, but they found that even though they had come to conflict with the British 15 years before, that the British were to be a protective force, and not only that, a supply of guns and munitions and other goods that were vital to them if they were to fight successfully and hold on to their way of life. But interestingly enough, not all Cherokees chose the path of resistance. After suffering defeats, some leaders, women and also women came into this, thought about negotiation, thought about what deals might be had, and how they could preserve themselves as a people. And two big words in the book are peoplehood and perseverance. And peoplehood is a feeling among a group of people that doesn't come from the top down. It's something that's learned in earliest youth. And depending on whether one is a boy or a girl, learning certain roles, learning to be Cherokee, and that being just part of one's very being, one's essence, that it becomes your nature, second nature. But still, we find individuality among a people who prize community above all. And you find a range of approaches among the Cherokees in terms of negotiation, in terms of war, and that itself is remarkable, and the characters we meet. And I will talk about some of them. I have some slides that reveal those, and there we have it. And for example, let's go, well, here's one of the themes, that peoplehood is usually inbred in early youth, passed from generation to generation. And you'll hear about that from the speaker next week too. And it is not dependent on imposition by state or governmental authority. Peoplehood as tribal or particular elements, distinguishing one group from another, though it may also have universal qualities. It's fundamentally felt by individuals rather than simply imagined. Well, how do they not only feel as a people locally by kinship, by clan, but then as a nation? And in a way, it's a creative approach to dealing with the United States and what they call the white people. Well, why did they call these colonials the white people? It's because the English called themselves the whites, the white people. So whether the natives first used the term or the colonials isn't exactly clear, but my hunch is because the English referred to themselves as white, and it was only natural that the natives would call them refer to the English as the white people. Well, how do we have a rich documentary record? I'll just say a few more words before I have a conversation with Patrick Lewis. And that is very importantly, pardon me for this, that we have a rich documentary record, of an extraordinarily rich documentary record. And as much as possible, I try to get at native voices, male as well, female as well as male, obscure as well as the well-known. Of course, the well-known figure, prominently we learn about individuals such as the Little Carpenter, as the English call him. His Cherokee name is Atakulakula, which means something like leaning wood, because he was slender and he was an extraordinarily able diplomat and speaker, and thus had this role with the English as a prime interlocutor in negotiation. And also you have Cherokee visits to England, where they will, let me go down this way, this route, maybe it'll work better, pardon me. And the point is that it is the British traders, Scottish as much as English, who go into Cherokee country, and they usually take native wives or mistresses, and then they learn the customs, the manners, the language, and that's all important. because it's these traders who act as interpreters at conferences and write down the record in detail. And also, they will pen letters from what is today Tennessee, west of the Appalachians, from Cherokee leaders, and what they write down on paper, and they'll send to Charleston, because Charleston was a very important center of the Indian trade, and the South Carolina governors had a major role during the British colonial period in terms of native relations. So it's through these, not only the traders, but the native women whom they had liaisons with, who they were more or less man and wife, that we have so much of a record because of their traders' role as interpreters, and not only in the exchange of goods. So before just closing here in this part of the talk, and you can see major periods that are covered by the book. 5 major periods there, and it goes beyond the American Revolutionary era to the presidency of Washington, and then the final chapter on the period 1800 to 1840. Let's go on. And I'll just give you here, and I don't mind receiving any help technically if it's necessary. We people from, well, I've been in Texas 41 years, but we from New Jersey, we know when we need help. So anyway, and Ostinaco, interesting, there are 2 Cherokee voyages to England in this period, well, on British ships. So there's an interesting diplomacy that way, and Ostinaco went to England in 1762. Only problem was the interpreter died on board on the ship on the way across the ocean. So when he got to England, he couldn't speak English. So he did see the king, George III, and they conversed, but they didn't understand a word that each other said. Well, let me get to the heart of what I wanted to bring up here. And pardon me if I took a little more time here. And it's a woman's voice. Nancy Ward, who speaks in public. There's never before an instance like that. Women are behind the scenes, they're very influential. But here she's speaking in public to North Carolina and Virginia representatives at a peace conference. And our people have been decimated during the Revolutionary War. It was Nancy Ward, as she was called by the Americans, and then her native name was Nanyahi. And she said, "You came and settled on our land and took it by main force. The treaty of the 4 years past was broken and a new peace was needed for all time. You know that women are always looked upon as nothing, but we are your mothers." She's speaking to the white officers, the colonels, the generals. "You are our sons. Our cry is all for peace. Let it continue, for we are your mothers. This peace must last forever. Let your women's sons be ours, and let our sons be yours. Let your women hear our word." Well, unfortunately, this speech is eloquent as it is, or this talk. And there are thousands of talks that one reads in the documentary record. And that's how you construct history. What's most important? What do you select? What is left out, unfortunately? The book is long enough, right? But I hope it tells a story that brings out the profound cultural and human dimension. That to me is all important. It's not military history as such. It does have war, it does have conflict. I try as much as possible to leave some room for the reader to make judgments, not just to impose my own throughout.
That seems
so this cultural and human dimension of history is all important, and the stories that are embedded within the past that speak to us today. And of course, the Cherokees endure as a people. And this is a statue of Nancy Ward, or Nanyahi, that's in a rural county in Tennessee, erected there some decades and probably in the early 1900s after she's gone. She lived well over 80 years, so she lived a very long life. Very interesting woman in her own self, right? Well, anyway, pardon me for the difficulties we had with the video, but I'll be sitting.
Please, yeah, let's pick up on some of those themes because you anticipated a large number of my questions, but that just means we have lots of threads to pick up and continue. I was fascinated by this perspective, and you mentioned earlier that as you dug into the Southern Appalachian story in this era, you realize that there are holes in the narrative. And I found very much a same feeling in reading the book. Once you recognize the Cherokees in geopolitical space in this part of the continent, you see how disconnected all of our historiographies are. None of the stories hold together until you sit here in the Southern mountains. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the worlds that the Cherokees are interacting with, both within their native context and then later within those European political contexts.
Right. And that's so true. I mean, that these worlds are interconnected. The Cherokees with many native people, the Chickasaws to the west, the Creeks, of course, have a major position in the book, often as rivals and enemies of the Cherokees, excuse me, and the Cherokees rely when they need to on British mediation to make peace with the Creeks, although it takes their effort as well. And as early as the 1720s, you have a remarkable Cherokee leader by the name of Long Warrior, who says to one of the English captains or colonels who goes up into the Cherokee country, and they are conversing through an interpreter, Eleazar Wiggin, who lived in the Cherokee country about 30 years. And Long Warrior says to Colonel Chicken, and that was his name, Chicken. I'm not making it up. He evidently was from Scotland, and he had come to South Carolina, and he was an expert in native affairs and also a little involved in trade. And he went up there on a diplomatic mission, and he meets Long Warrior at his village of Tennessee, recognize the name, and this is west of the mountains, in what the British called the Overhill country, because it's over the hills, and 500 miles from Charleston. And Long Warrior tells Colonel Chicken, well, if we make peace with the southwards, and the southwards are the Muskogees or the Creeks, then we'll have an easier time with the French Indians, those allied with the French, who are enemies to the north. We won't have to be fighting all on all sides. So there's a strategic thinking there that's quite remarkable. And one sees that. And also these interconnections and the fact that the Cherokees, to up their leverage with the British, will raid French river traffic on the Ohio and the Wabash. And they know all the waters. They know the country to the Mississippi. They're familiar with the country to the Great Lakes. And this native knowledge of geography is commented on by one of South Carolina's governors, where he asked one of the native men to draw a map on paper. And the man did, just on chalk on the dirt floor. And he said, and Governor Glenn remarked afterwards, it's extraordinary that this map is nearly as accurate as our own. How, and that country to the southwest, Glenn thinks, must be very rich, and a place where he's imagining future British settlement, although he doesn't say that out loud at the time.
Well, and I was also reflecting, and I really appreciated your comment earlier about the decentralized nature of power and decision making down to the individual level, then on the town level, then on these regional levels within the Cherokee nation, though that's not a political entity, but a cultural group. And I also reflected on, through the Cherokee eyes in this book, we see the similar fractures in colonial governments, right? South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia and Georgia and Pennsylvania do not have policies that agree with one another. And we think of those entities as British or then later American, but we see them interacting differently with the Cherokee. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what we see about the colonial governments and what we learn about them through Cherokee eyes.
We find, for example, in the southern region, that South Carolina's governors and its legislators, for that matter, wanted to be the kingpins in relations with all the southern Indian peoples. And they had the advantage of Charlestown, which they called it then, later shortened to Charleston, as the port. And the goods coming in from Britain, all the metalware, all the cloth, guns, munitions, many, many, many items. And so the traders, of course, are working not through government directly, but private entrepreneurship. And they're often buying from big guys, and they're in debt to them, and they're going to try to make a profit through the native trade. And then and the native peoples in the South are trading mainly deer skins. And in the early period, they're also trading Indian slaves, which was a very big thing in the southeastern part of the continent, where they're capturing members of other tribes and nations and selling them to the British. And those are often exported out to the Caribbean or to the northern colonies. It was a very significant traffic until about 1720. And so you find that South Carolina at the time of the French and Indian War, the governor there doesn't want Virginia to take the lead. He's very stingy in supporting Virginia, won't send troops up or just a small number, writes to London that the governor of Virginia knows nothing about Indian affairs. And we know a great deal here in South Carolina. And that man who's writing himself is a Scottish fellow who's come over to be governor of Carolina, South Carolina. But once there, he identifies with that province. It's his power sense, and also his sense of power. And also he believes that if the British establish forts in the Cherokee country, they will solidify their position continentally against the French. And under his governorship and the successor to that man, the British do build forts, and with Cherokee permission, 2 forts, one in the lower towns, which are in today's far western South Carolina, where the ground rises before the face of the Blue Ridge, and then 1 fort in the Overhill country west of the Appalachians, some 500 miles from Charleston. And no one sees at the moment that in the year 1760, the British and Cherokees are going, allies presumably, are going to come to war, because of when the Cherokees go up to help the British in the war and fight in the Ohio country, they pass through the Shenandoah Valley. And they'll plunder at times farms, and the settlers there will shoot down Cherokees. And they kill about 30 in 2 different episodes over the course of a year or so. And then the Cherokees take their vengeance against Carolina settlers. And the governor of South Carolina says, well, what we must say to the Cherokees is you must offer satisfaction. You must deliver 20 Cherokees to us who are guilty of killing the whites, our subjects under the king's protection. You deliver them or their scalps. The scalps are just as good. And then we'll have satisfaction. But unless you do that, there will be war. And what the governor did, Littleton, he was an Englishman, he deceived the Cherokees, he took hostages, he marched the hostages to a fort in the Cherokee country, and he held them there. And things went from bad to worse. And then a general war broke out between the Cherokees and the British because the Cherokees were just aghast at the hostage taking. And it's a complex situation, don't have time to go into the detail, but it was a bloody affair. But after that war, the Cherokees, through diplomacy, reconcile with Britain. And they view the king, the great king, they didn't view the great king as an enemy. They viewed the great king as someone who had pledged protection to them. When the first Cherokee delegation went to London with a Scottish adventurer in 1730, which is a remarkable story itself told in the book. It's chapter 4, probably one of the most colorful. And these 7 Cherokee men find themselves in a city of 500,000 people, you know? Just think of that. And crossing what they called the Great Water. These people and men who had never seen the sea. And they get there and they get a paper from that king and from the British Privy Council. And it says that the Cherokees will be in league with the British, and they are as much his children, the king's children, as the British subjects. And the king will offer his protection. And the Cherokees say, we will fight with you. We will not fight against you, but rather alongside you against the king's enemies. We will fight and die alongside you. That's the mark of true kinship among men. And the Cherokees take that very seriously. They take the treaty, and they can't read a word of it, but they take that treaty to the Overhill country, and they store it there. And during the American Revolution, the militia of Virginia attacking the Cherokees finds that treaty in a bunch of diplomatic papers in one of the chief's homes. And that Virginia colonel thinks the Cherokees are double-crossing the Americans, pretending peace when they mean war, but actually the men who kept that record, or who made sure these were stored, Oconostata, was very wise. He could call upon that, not only use memory, but there was this sign, there was something in these papers that could be summoned as necessary. And just anticipating going on, the book deals with the American Revolutionary era in depth, where you have the height of conflict between the ongoing settlers, which are moving into the native country in a more aggressive manner. And of course, that is very evident during the American Revolution. The Cherokees suffered terribly, as terribly as any native people east of the Mississippi. The Iroquois also did as well. But I would say the Cherokees just as terribly, but they still recover. They recover. They rebuild. They found new villages near Lookout Mountain and Chickamauga Creek. And you'll hear of the Chickamaugas. They are the more militant Cherokees. But there are other Cherokees who want to make a peace with the Americans. And Nancy Ward, a Nanahe, is working with those. And she's very interesting as a diplomatic intermediary. And she comes out into the open in 1781, and Thomas Jefferson is writing about her to the Virginia militia commander. And he says, well, you make sure that Nancy Ward, the famous Indian woman, is treated respectfully. Because he knew how much she had aided the Virginians. She was not a traitor to her people, not in the least. But she was attempting to protect her own kin and community by warning the Virginians that there would be a militant attack coming. She was no traitor, not in the least. And she lives into the 18-teens, 1820 about, and she's steadfast against the Cherokees ceding their lands to the United States and moving west of the Mississippi. So again, pardon me for speaking a little length there, but the book covers a lot of territory. I hope with interest and drama that, and I try to write it, I'll say, for the general history reading public. I didn't want to write it simply for academics, not at all. I've been in academia for a long time. I happen to be, just a personal note, why not share it? Happen to be just retiring now. And I am concerned, which you're going to have a speaker about, and I'm not going to go on about it today. I am concerned about the state of higher education in this country, especially in the liberal arts, including history.
Well, let's get back to the fundamentals of history research, as you've touched on a couple of times. I always keep an eye out for Filson connections, and I was glad that you mentioned coming here for research. Which pieces of this came out of the Filson archives, and what did they add to the overall narrative?
I have a couple of documents right here, and they're really quite telling. One is by Arthur Campbell, although he didn't sign the letter. He was a leading settler in southwestern Virginia, and he was one who favored the creation of a new frontier state, the state of Franklin. He wanted that region of what is today eastern Tennessee to break away from North Carolina. And there was a separatist movement to break away from North Carolina led by John Sevier. He was one of the leaders along with Campbell. Sevier was a famous Indian fighter and a very tough man. And the state of Franklin lasted only a couple of years, but it had an impact. It took a very aggressive stance toward the Cherokees. Later, when the state of Franklin was done with, and this area became part of what was called the Southwest Territory of the United States, Washington, under the new federal government, because the Constitution makes a big difference, now we're out, we no longer are under the Articles of Confederation. We have a national government, a president, Congress with authority ostensibly over the entire United States. And even the militia will answer to the federal government, even though they may act on their own, in reality. So you have here in 1793 an episode in which a Major Baird, living in eastern Tennessee today, is on a raid. He knows that an Indian raiding party composed probably of Shawnees and Cherokees has killed a white man and a boy in the area. And Baird rounds up 50 men to go after that group and to trace them and find the track. But he comes to the Tennessee River and he can't ford it then. So he takes his men and he goes into a nearby Cherokee town. That town had nothing to do with the attack on the whites. Its most important leader was a man by the name of Skolakata, which means big or round or even fat in Cherokee. I don't know the Cherokee language, but the white settlers called him Hanging Maw. They'd often give nicknames to which we refer to as girth, And Skolakata was a very wise man. He, as a younger man, had captured Daniel Boone's daughter in a raid, but he treated her quite well. No harm was done in the end. Boone got his daughter Jemima back. And Skolakata in 1793 finds himself and his village being attacked by Major Baird. And Baird and his men kill 8 Indians, including Skolakata's, one of his children, and wound him and others, and 8 are killed. And these natives, this often happens. Settler vigilantism is a very powerful and terrible force, where in response to the native attacks, which I do not minimize in the book, but they believe, of course, they're defending their land, their soil, and they attack settlements that are exposed. It's guerrilla warfare. It is a type of terror. And women and children are victims. and there are many captives taken as well. And the fate of the captives depends on their age. Are they young children, then they can be saved. If they're older, and especially if they're male, they're going to be executed or perhaps traded, but usually killed. And you have some dramatic stories that way. Well, in this case, and the whites will, the settlers will, of course, who are mainly Anglo-American, but not exclusively, because obviously the Scots are part of that. There's some German settlers in the area too, but mainly Anglo-American, including the broad Scottish group, and Scots-Irish, I should mention too, very important. They will take vengeance. They don't think a thing of it. And eventually, Colonel William Whitley of Kentucky, in the crucial attack on the Chickamauga towns, the most militant in 1794, he takes 150 men from Kentucky, working with the leaders in what is today Tennessee, James Robertson, the founder of Nashville, and William Blount, who was in Knoxville as the governor of Southwest Territory. And Whitley with 150 militiamen, along with 400 others militia of the Southwest Territory, they move into Nick-Jack and running water towns on the Tennessee River near Lookout Mountain in September 1794. They cross the river at night. They surprise, they devastate those centers of militant resistance. And it's a very decisive action. And here is Whitley's representation to the Kentucky legislature saying that he should be compensated and his men for what they did and their service. And he was to some degree, but I don't know if he got all what he thought he and his men had earned. Of course, plunder was part of warfare too in that period for whites as well as natives. So this was a very decisive moment because in 1794, the Cherokees in several regions consult and they decide on a peace with the United States. They negotiate with William Blount at Tellico Station or Blockhouse. Then on the Tellico River, those of us remember the Tellico Dam. You remember that controversy way back in the 70s and about the snail darter and whether the dam should be built. Well, anyway, that's there was no dam, of course, then. These rivers were free flowing. And the conference took place, and the Cherokees collectively decided on a peace. And they never broke that peace held. We think of the Trail of Tears in 1838. They were at peace with the United States for over 40 years before that time. Not only that, but they aid the United States in war against the Creek militants, the Red Sticks, in the brutal fighting of 1814. And at the Battle of the Tallapoosa, in which Jackson depends on the Cherokees a good deal to smash and decimate the Red Sticks. But Jackson will not hold that in the Cherokees' favor when he's president and forces them into the treaty in 1835. It was actually during the presidency of Martin Van Buren that the Trail of Tears actually occurred, but Jackson had set it in motion.
Well, I think that brings us around sort of chronologically full circle through the end of the book. I wanted to throw open for about 15 minutes of questions. Scott has the mic that he can bring around to anyone who would like to raise their hands.
Oh, Patrick? Get the machine
We can work on that too.
but please,
Here we go. Thank you. I wanted to appreciate your presentation, and I wanted to ask you to go a little more in depth about the matriarchal leadership structure of the Cherokees. In their book, David Wingrove and David Graeber describe a similar matriarchal leadership structure in the Wendat Huron, and maybe even theorize that that was a reaction for several centuries following the collapse of the Cahokia civilization. I know pre-1670 was out of the scope of your research, but whether you see ties throughout Native Americans pre-Columbian to some event that led them to all be led in many ways in a matriarchal way, and also whether by and large that played a role. Maybe they were ahead of their time, and here we are with ships full of testosterone-laden Europeans that aren't prone to negotiation, and whether that made them in many ways ripe for the pickings.
Well, I think your question's very fascinating, especially about the pre-Columbian part. I'll say, just talk to the last part first, that while the coastal peoples are decimated first by disease and not simply conquered, and you have to look at what occurs, for example, in New England with the Puritan settlements in Massachusetts, Connecticut, very small Rhode Island, and the Pequot War, and then the much larger, quote, King Philip's War, Metacoms in the 1600s. You can see what occurs in Virginia and the conflict with the Powhatans. In other words, and then South Carolina comes along 1670. And they aren't just set out to make war on the Indians, but what happens is they see the example of what's already occurred, especially in Virginia. There's already an Indian slave trade. And if they can make alliances with powerful native nations and reap profit through the Indian slave trade, which happens, and the influential men become involved in that, and officials. And it's really not on the orders from London. Not at all. The colony of Carolina, which first included North and South, was under at first the governance by proprietors who remained in England. But it was the guys on the ground who controlled things. And they needed native allies. And certainly for the interior groups, nations remained viable through the American Revolution and even beyond. You know, if you think of the Cherokees, the Creeks or Muskogees, Shawnees, who play a larger role and a huge role in Kentucky, far beyond their numbers would suggest in terms of warfare, although there was also a negotiating faction among the Shawnees, very importantly, and then the Great Lakes nations. And one of the Cherokee leaders was Attakullakulla, I mentioned earlier, who went to England in 1730 as a youth. He's later captured by Canada Indians. He's brought up to Canada. He's there for about 10 years. He could have been killed. But he survives and he comes back, and maybe he survived through his diplomatic skill. And he proves very, very adept at negotiating with the British over time. But eventually he weakened, maybe because of alcohol and other problems over time, and he becomes too much of a man who will concede to the settlers, who will make a treaty of cession, even though he would not like to do that, and find other leaders who will go along with that just to make peace. But your question also had to do with the pre-Columbian. And that had a huge impact that archaeologists have explored. And what they talk about is that in the Mississippi Valley, at least, there were powerful native chiefdoms with hierarchical command structure. But these, for unknown reasons, war, drought, subsistence struggles, they diminished those powerful societies well before the coming of the European. And there was a process of decentralization, and life centered more on village and town and kinship as the bond. And women's role happened to be paramount in kinship. Not all groups, native groups, measured kinship through the matrilineal, through the mother's line, but the Cherokees did. And the Attakulla, for example, when he met Governor Littleton in South, he must have gone, Attakulla traveled to, Little Carpenter traveled to Charleston about 10 times at least over a period of years. You wouldn't even believe it because each journey is several hundred miles. And at one time, Littleton says to him, well, we'll build a fort in your country and our warriors will help you. And also our women who will go along with the men, our women will teach your women about sewing and making clothes and useful art. Attakulla didn't say a word, but he was not happy. And a week later, in the next conference with Littleton, he said, in words that are translated, I must say, why aren't there white women here in the council? We have our women participating in council in our towns, and there are women, Cherokee women, right outside this house, this governor's house. Where are your women? He was needling the governor. And he also then made a remark that the fort that the British built along the Little Tennessee River, which flows northward into the Big Tennessee, was on a downslope and not that well planned, and therefore couldn't very well protect the women and children of the Cherokee. So he's making a very interesting argument about gender roles, but he's also thinking of warriors as protectors, too, of women and children, which was very deeply inbred in the culture. The Cherokees did have war women, it should be said, women who would assist in war at various times, and they would be recognized for that extraordinary honor. Nancy Ward herself, and why does she have the name Nancy Ward? Because she married a trader by the name of Bryant Ward, who didn't live all that long with her, but had a couple of children by her. And then she's known to the whites as Nancy Ward. Her name is Nanyehi in the Cherokee. And her children, one of her daughters will be a mistress of a Virginia captain who rises to colonel and later general of militia then in North Carolina. And that's a very interesting relationship, since that same officer has a wife in Virginia at the time. And he has 7 children by the first wife, and then he marries again. I forget which, he had 10 by, and then the 7 by the second wife. And meanwhile, he has Betsy, who is the daughter of Nanyehi or Nancy Ward, when he's visiting Cherokee country. So he's a big man. I mean, the Cherokees called him big because he was tall, and I won't go into, that's enough.
Please.
I've always had the impression that the clashes at Nickajack and Running Waters haven't really been deeply woven into history and memory as much as other frontier events. And do you think that perhaps Anthony Wayne's victory at Fallen Timbers, which I think took place in August of 1794, kind of pushed Nickajack into the background?
Well, that's a great question. One, it refers to the Whitley's participation, the Kentucky men's participation in the raid and the attack on Nickajack and Running Water, 2 of the key Chickamauga towns, the radical or militant, militants more accurate, Cherokees. And the fact is, when that attack was launched, I don't believe news of Anthony Wayne's victory had yet reached Eastern Tennessee. The decision to make the attack was made, and it was carried out in September. I don't recall the date in September, But I will say this, it was a devastating attack. And to learn about it and its consequences, you find that the men are saying, look what we found here. We found the articles of clothing and weapons of white people and who were captured or killed. And of course, the scores of horses. Horses were a major article to be captured. The governor of the Southwest Territory said the Indians over this period of years, those enemies of us, must have stolen 1,000 horses. But to get at the heart of your question, yes, Anthony Wayne's victory had a big effect. And also, if you look at the memory of these events in the folk history, and you go to Lyman Draper's collection, and Lyman Draper lived in the 19th century, and he was an historian who collected a great deal of material of the Western frontiers, or else we would know little, not nearly as much as we did. And he interviewed particularly men and some women when they were older. What did they remember? And some of the white men who talked to Draper said openly, well, we just shot at the Indian women who went to swim across the river. And one Indian woman was holding a child with her. And she dropped the child into the river and swam. And another one we thought was good looking, so we didn't shoot at her. Well, that's not in the record of 1794. We only know that from recollections of men of the 1830s. And they're just talking about it as if they're doing nothing. And William Whitley said, these are desperate, merciless, degenerate savages we are attacking. And they have caused havoc over a broad area for years. They must be, in his words, he used the verb extirpate. And so there is this part of history which you don't have to always judge as an historian. You write about it, but it's there. You shouldn't hide from it. One other point about Wayne. At the peace talks at Tellico, by that time, which the peace talks were in early November of that year, a couple of months later, Anthony Wayne's victory over the Northern Indian Confederacy of the Great Lakes region, Ohio country, was known. And at a certain point in the negotiation, William Blount said to John Watts, the Cherokee leader, Konoskiski. He was the daughter of a Cherokee woman by a trader named John Watts Sr., a little guy. And he was as ardent a Cherokee as you will ever find. And the whites know him as John Watts. And he's now coming to make peace along with Skolacutta with William Blount. And toward the end of the negotiations, they've decided on a peace. Blount says, well, Watts, Colonel Watts, who's Cherokee, but he honors him with that name. Do you know about Anthony Wayne's victory and what happened there? And interestingly, Watts or Konoskiski said nothing. He listened, but he knew, but he wasn't going to either yell at the man, just hold his peace and his dignity and honor. So it's a very striking moment. But I think the Southern campaign is very important. This is one of the reasons the Southern states had an animus against the federal government that exceeded that above the Ohio. Because above the Ohio, the federal government aided the settlers with the two campaigns that failed miserably, Farmers and St. Clair's in 1790-91, and then Wayne's victory in 94, and then the treaty that followed. Whereas in south of the Ohio, the settlers are pretty much on their own. And they resented the lack of federal support. And that memory lingered, I believe.
That's a really fascinating point. Very quickly, we are over time, but let's have one more to round us out.
Can you speak on Sequoia and his creation of the syllabary for the Cherokee people?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and you really helped me because it's toward the end of the book, and I wanted to bring in Sequoia and the great changes of the early 1800s, when the Cherokees now have a leadership that consists of a good number of mixed ancestry men. Usually, almost always, not always though, but usually Cherokee women, native men. And the men consider themselves Cherokees, but they're English speaking. Women also, more often, some women I found as interpreters of treaty or negotiation, because they were of mixed ancestry too. So you find that the society changed, and the whites, the federal government wanted Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Washington as president wanted them to adopt a plan of civilization. And they did distribute looms and spinning wheels. And the native women did spin and weave a great amount of cloth. And they wanted the men to become farmers, which was far more, in the white man style, which the men did not want to do, but the men were okay with grazing and with raising the cattle and the pigs. The hogs were already plentiful and adopted into the diet. And then you have a Cherokee elite emerges, which also owns slaves, black slaves, yes, captured in wars. And that, even though the percentage of Cherokee slaveholders is maybe 5–6%, they own about 90% of the slaves in the Cherokee country. And you find that that elite wants to maintain slavery, black slavery, when they're forced to emigrate to the new Indian territory. About Sequoia, Sequoia was a man remarkable. He was of mixed ancestry himself. His father was a guy named Guess and was a trader. And we don't know much about him. His mother was fully Cherokee. He was fully Cherokee in outlook, in manner. He wasn't that comfortable among all the whites, in particular, from what we know. And he was skilled in artisanal work. He didn't come from a very prominent family, but about 1820, or even before then, he began to experiment with the symbols that would signify words. It's really quite remarkable. He wanted to give his people a way of communicating with each other, of strengthening the bonds among themselves, and not as dependent upon the whites. Though he was someone who wanted peace with the whites, the greatest Cherokee dream of the early 1800s was to be at peace with the United States and be recognized as a sovereign people within their own lands. Sequoia he lost land, his family, in one of the session of 1819, and he goes to Arkansas. There are about 3,000 Cherokees living in Arkansas in the 1820s because they saw the handwriting on the wall, and the federal government offered them guarantees of land in Arkansas, which proved worthless in the end. So Sequoia is a remarkable figure. And he raised a family. And if you go to, I live in Texas now, 41 years, and it's only a few hours north, across the Red River. And the native Texans will say, then you're entering a new country because you're in the Republic of Texas, whatever. I'm making a little joke there. But actually, in Oklahoma, in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, you will see, if you go on a trip in the area, Tecumseh's cabin, which is beautifully restored and kept. Parts of that cabin still are there. And so he's a remarkable figure. And one historian who's written about it, who's more of an expert on that than I would be, has written about it as something of spiritual regeneration. And Sequoyah also wanted the Cherokees to have an outlet to the west. You know that strip of Oklahoma that goes to the west in the Panhandle? The Cherokees would have had that as their land, as a way out if they needed it. But eventually they'll give that up. And then other things will happen. And it's a very complex history. But I'll end with one note. One of the strengths of the negotiation, and they're skilled at it, it was keeping peace among themselves. And Henry Timberlake, a British officer just after the French and Indian War, he was actually Virginian. He said, "Isn't it remarkable that these people who we think of as savages know how to disagree with one another and yet keep a peace? Ostinaco is of a different party than Atakulakula, and yet they will get along. They will respect each other. Isn't that remarkable?" And much of that was true throughout the 1700s, but it breaks down in the 1800s under the great pressure of the US government to get them to remove at the behest of the southern states. Ultimately, Georgia, of course, had the big push, but it wasn't alone in that. And that the pressure is too great, and there are social gaps between the wealthy and the less well-to-do, between those who are, quote, full bloods, those are mixed, but it's a more complicated society, and there are fissures. And in fissures, rifts. And in 1806, for example, a leader who signs a treaty with the US and gives away land and is one of the main architects of that is assassinated by another Cherokee, the Ridge. The Ridge and his son and nephew were later, 30 years later, signed the Treaty of Cession with the United States. Though 2/3 to 3/4 of the nation were against it, signing that treaty. They thought they'd get the best that they could. Well, there was between a rock and a hard place, right? Well, when they came out to the new Indian Territory in what is today Oklahoma, those 3 men were targeted by other Cherokees and killed in a single day. So they knew. And even the Ridge is said to have remarked that when I signed that treaty, I signed my death warrant. So it's a remarkable story. It's truly a greatly American story. I'm obviously entranced by it, and I hope if I'm so pleased to have an opportunity to share that enthusiasm with you and something of what I attempted, and I hope if you do purchase the book, you'll enjoy it, and so it means a great deal to an individual if one writes a book, that it will stimulate interest.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay.